Chapter 8, The Global Shift, How this Ism Fundamentally Changed World History/Politics. If one were to name a solitary agent of a long historical transformation, the Socratic method would deserve a central placement. Not as a political program, not as a creed, and not as a manifesto of a party, but as a practice and ism in the broad, almost forensic sense of a systematic approach to knowledge, virtue, and shared life. The method of Socrates' discipline of relentless questioning, lively dialogue, and careful testing of definitions began as a pedagogical technique in ancient Athens. Yet its aftershocks have resounded across continents, centuries, and civilizations. It did not create a single political system, but it cultivated the habits of mind skepticism tempered by a desire for clarity, courage, and public justification that underwrite liberal democracies, rule of law cultures, and robust civil societies. Chapter 8 asks, how did this global shift unfold? How did a set of interrogative practices become a force shaping world history and politics? 1. The essence of the technique and why it matters globally. The Socratic method, in its purest form, is not an argument but a diagnostic session of questioning. It begins with a term people think they understand: justice, virtue, courage, piety, and proceeds, not to decree an answer, but to test the term's meaning by probing contingent beliefs, examining counterexamples, and exposing contradictions. The aim is not to win an argument but to achieve shared clarity. Socrates' method elenchus, cross-examination, and refutation moves from accepted opinions to persistent ignorance, from the apparent to the essential, from mere belief to defended, rational justification. How, then, does a method of dialogue become a political climate? Because the skill set cultivated by this method articulate reasoning, precise definitions, the willingness to revise one's views in light of counter-evidence, and the insistence that power warrants justification transforms how people participate in public life. It makes discourse a serious instrument of legitimacy. Leaders cannot claim authority without offering reasons that withstand critical scrutiny. Laws cannot endure unless their terms can be defined, tested, and debated in open forums. Communities cannot endure without a habit of listening to dissent and revising policies in light of reasoned argument. The global relevance lies in the universality of the problem Socrates faced: how to secure truth and just policy through dialogue when power seeks obedience and tradition seeks to preserve itself. The solution the method offers, dialogue oriented toward shared understanding, provides a template for civic engagement that transcends a specific city-state or era. When transplanted into other soils, it grows into institutions, rituals, and practices that empower citizens to participate in governance, to contest claims, and to hold rulers accountable. 2. Athens, the crucible and the paradox of inquiry. Socrates operated within a political ecosystem that prized debate as a public good and feared it as a threat to order. Athenian democracy aspired to be a polity of deliberation, yet its dynamic energy could tilt toward tyranny of the majority or the demagogic appeal of charisma. Socrates, with his relentless questioning, exposes a paradox. Inquiry is the lifeblood of a free political order, yet the same inquiry can destabilize the power structures that grant a city its coherence. In the Apology and the Dialogues, Socrates is at once the gadfly and the physician of the city. He exposes the pretenses of certainty, shows how slogans become substitutes for reasoning, and invites his fellow citizens to examine whether they really know what they claim to know. His execution, an offer of truth that Athens finds intolerable, symbolizes a political economy of knowledge. When a community cannot tolerate the admission of ignorance, it will punish the seeker who seeks to name it. The significance is not simply that a wise man died, but that a political order that prizes critical inquiry cannot simply subsist by suppressing the very method that gives it future legitimacy. This paradox has a global ripple effect. The chapter's point is not to condemn Athens but to illuminate a universal pattern. The practice of rigorous questioning creates political legitimacy through accountability, and it exposes political risk when rulers equate their authority with immutable truths. The crucible of Athens thus becomes a prototype for how a society might either nurture the conditions for democratic deliberation or oscillate toward dogmatic coercion. 3. From Greece to Rome and into the medieval and early modern worlds. After Socrates' death, his ideas spread mainly through his student, Plato, whose dialogues preserved and reframed the method within a broader metaphysical and political architecture. The thread did not fray, it braided into Roman legal culture, Christian theology, and the scholastic habit of disputation. In Rome, dialectical reasoning reinforced a jurisprudential culture that prized argument as a means of clarifying law and governance. The cross-pollination, however indirect, mattered. When legal rational modes of thought traveled, the political logic of assertion required justification, and the habit of public debate matured. In the medieval West, disputation, often framed within the university as a form of scholastic method, intensified the culture of argument. The method itself migrated into the pedagogy of the faith and the governance ideals that would later be celebrated by reformers. The key point is not that medieval Europe invented the Socratic method anew, but that it carried the method into institutions where power could be checked through trained reasoning. The schoolroom became a seedbed for political culture, teachers as guardians of method, students as future guardians of public reasoning, and rulers who could be pressed to justify their laws and governance with reasons accessible to all. What makes this transmission global is the universality of the problem solved by the method: how to rule justly by appealing to reasons that others can test and evaluate. When the method travels beyond European orbit, through translation movements, exchanges among scholars, and the practicalities of colonial and post-colonial education, it catalyzes a broader shift. The practice in the university, the law court, and the legislative chamber accrues legitimacy by public, rational justification. The global shift begins to take a recognizable shape. It is not just a technique of instruction but a public ethic of deliberation. 4. The Enlightenment and the modern political order. The Enlightenment did not invent the Socratic method, it inherited the culture of critical inquiry and then refracted it through new political visions. Philosophers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, Kant, and Hume did not simply argue about sovereignty or rights. They insisted that the legitimacy of political authority rests on reasons that individuals can in principle endorse. The method, Socratic in spirit, provided a model for how to engage with claims, test them against evidence, and revise beliefs in light of universalizable criteria. This shift bears on world history and politics in several interlocking ways. The emergence of public reason as a political ideal, the idea that ordinary citizens can participate in the justification of laws, or at least demand that those laws be justifiable to them, relies on a cultivated capacity for reasoned dialogue. Socratic questioning offers a portable toolkit for the formation of a public sphere in which political legitimacy rests on deliberative processes, not merely on coercive authority or hereditary prerogative. The move toward rights and constitutionalism: if political legitimacy requires reasons accessible to all, then the protection of individual rights, checks and balances, and procedural fairness become the political technologies that translate reason into democratic governance. The method's insistence on explicit definitions: what is justice? What is liberty? What is equality? Finds its political correlates in constitutions, legal codes, and institutions designed to make rights visible and contestable. The critique of power through accountability: the method trains citizens and rulers alike to demand justification. This fosters transparency and accountability in governance, making it harder for rulers to act unilaterally without moral and logical warrant. Over the long arc, this discipline helps erode arbitrary rule and encourage mechanisms of inquiry, review, and reform. A universal rhetoric of conversation, the method's emphasis on listening, questioning, and revising fosters an ethos of dialogue that can cross cultural lines. Although different political cultures disagree about what counts as legitimate authority and how to organize the state, the universal aspiration to reason together, whether in a parliamentary assembly, a court, a school, or a public forum, owes something to Socratic practice. The Enlightenment thus helps translate the Socratic method into political technology, a disciplined discourse that makes public life legible to those who inhabit it, and, crucially, legible to those who would contest or resist it. The political revolutions, American, French, and beyond, are not simply about new documents or new leaders, but about new ways of speaking to power, new standards of justification, and new rituals of public argument. 5. The global diffusion, dialogues that cross borders and cultures. The Socratic method did not remain confined to Greek antiquity or even Western Europe. Its core impulse, reasoning through dialogue, defending claims with reasons, exposing contradictions, found hospitable ground in diverse intellectual climates. In the Islamic world, the Arabic tradition of rational theology, the Mu'tazila, and the subsequent works of philosophers such as Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd, Averroes, engaged in systematic argumentation that echoed the Socratic aim to define terms, test beliefs, and reach conclusions that can be justified by reason. The method was not adopted as a mirror image of Greek pedagogy but was assimilated into a robust culture of disputation, ijtihad, independent reasoning in jurisprudence, and philosophical dialogue. The result, a flourishing of science, medicine, and law that altered political life in vast imperial and commercial networks. In this space, the Socratic ideal of questioning authority found resonance in a cognitive ecology where rulers often sought legitimacy through rational explanation, jurisprudential consent, and public debate. In South Asia and East Asia, the transmission of Greek rationalism via translations and exchanges helped shape discourses about knowledge, law, and governance. The Nyaya school in Indian philosophy, with its rigorous logic and epistemology, shares with the Socratic method a zeal for precise terms, sound inference, and the testing of claims. In China, the tradition of debate among scholars and officials, often framed as administrative examination and civil conduct, emphasized concordance with established principles and a public, dialogic culture of governance, even if not a direct descendant of Socrates in a lineal sense. In all these regions, the patience, humility, and stubborn insistence on criteria of justification that the Socratic method embodies became a durable resource, a common grammar for assessing political claims, espousing reforms, and negotiating authority. In the modern era, the globalization of education, public schools, universities, and international exchanges carried the Socratic habit into classrooms worldwide. The practice of Socratic seminars in which students interrogate each other's interpretations, the use of guided questioning in law schools, the Socratic method in the classroom, and the emphasis on critical thinking as a core competency in leadership development are direct, living legacies. The method thus operates as a cultural technology, a portable method of shaping citizens who can participate in deliberative processes, critique policies, and contribute to governance in diverse political systems. Sex, the method, power, and the risks of a global shift. No account of the global shift would be complete without acknowledging the method's tensions with power. Socratic questioning can threaten rulers who rely on dogmatic authority, coercive discipline, or manufactured consensus. The method's power lies in its capacity to reveal the limits of certainty, to expose the fragile ground on which political authority rests, and to invite continuous revision of laws and institutions. In pluralistic polities, this is a virtue. In autocratic regimes, the same impulse can be dangerous and destabilizing, provoking censorship, repression, or exile of dissenters. The global diffusion of the Socratic habit also reveals a paradox. A tool of emancipation can be co-opted by those who manipulate dialogue for propaganda, performative dissent, or strategic ambiguity. Parodies of the Socratic method, empty questions that trap interlocutors in rhetoric rather than reason, or a dialogue designed to delegitimize opponents without seeking truth, pose a modern challenge: how to preserve the integrity of inquiry in an information ecosystem saturated with manipulation. The educational project, Socratic seminars, critical pedagogy, and deliberative forums must therefore be vigilant about preserving an ethic of genuine inquiry, humility before complexity, openness to revision, and a commitment to public justification that honors the dignity of every participant. 7. The global shift in practice, education, law, and political culture. What does this mean in concrete terms for world history and politics? Several enduring patterns emerge. Education as a democratic technology, this is perhaps the most visible political consequence. Socratic questioning, as an educational method, teaches students to articulate their beliefs, to listen to others, and to revise their views in light of good reasons. A population educated in this way becomes more capable of participating in deliberative processes, more resistant to demagoguery, and more adaptable to the demands of rapidly changing political environments. The law is a discipline of justification. In many legal systems, the demand that a rule or a verdict be justified by reasons that others can examine is a direct inheritance of a Socratic commitment. Courts, constitutions, and bureaucratic institutions function with a common expectation: public justification precedes public authority. This is not merely an academic ideal, it translates into accountability mechanisms, transparency initiatives, and the rule of law that characterizes many modern states. Deliberative democracy and civil society. The global shift nurtures a culture in which civil society's vitality depends on the capacity of citizens to deliberate, to argue, and to reach reasoned compromises. The dialogic spirit that Socrates exemplified, engaging rather than defeating one another, becomes a template for parliaments, councils, town halls, and civic organizations across continents. Global ethics of justification. In a connected world, political legitimacy often hinges on cross-cultural dialogue about universal values such as equality, freedom, and human rights. The Socratic insistence on making moral claims explainable to others, on making reasons public, gives political actors in varied systems a common standard by which to evaluate laws and policies. 8. A concluding synthesis, the living chain of the Socratic gift. If one were to trace the chain from Socrates to the present day, the arc is not straight, it is serpentine, braided with other ideas, and sometimes interrupted by historical tumult. Yet the line remains discernible. The Socratic method did not merely leave a mark on philosophy, it seeded a cognitive transformation that eventually informed political institutions and the global culture of reasoning. It is a chain of practices, defining terms with precision, testing beliefs against counterexamples, listening to opposing arguments with charity, and revising conclusions in light of reason, that moved from the private study into the public square, from a city-state to a worldwide reflex of governance. The world history of politics, its revolutions, reforms, and daily rituals of governance rests on this habit of critical inquiry. In democracies, this habit supports accountability. In constitutional regimes, it sustains legitimacy. In civil societies, it fosters tolerance and the capacity to coexist with pluralism. The cross-cultural diffusion of the method did not erase differences in political culture, it multiplied the tools with which societies might negotiate those differences. The ism of the Socratic method, therefore, is not an ideology with a single message for every context. It is a metacultural practice, a universal approach to knowledge and life that provides a flexible, robust framework for shaping political life across civilizations. 9. Epilogue, teaching the method in a complex era. The global shift remains ongoing. Our era, characterized by rapid technological change, information abundance, and an increasingly contested public sphere, demands the same attentiveness Socrates urged: continuous questioning, careful definition, cooperative search for truth, and a readiness to adjust beliefs when presented with better reasons. To sustain the Socratic method in today's politics requires pedagogical commitment to critical thinking, institutional safeguards that protect the space for dissent, and a public culture that treats disagreement not as treachery but as a condition for learning and progress. In a world where power can speak through slogans louder than evidence, Socrates' practice, dialogue as the primary instrument of truth-seeking, offers an enduring alternative. The global shift it catalyzed is not merely historical, it is an ongoing invitation to keep asking, to keep listening, to keep shaping governance by the strength of our reasons and the courage to revise them. Thus, the portrait of Socrates remains not only a portrait of a man but of a method that travels, evolves, and continues to reshape the world. In the quiet, often repetitive motions of a Socratic seminar, a parliament in Lagos, a courtroom in Dakar, a classroom in Delhi, or a town meeting in Helsinki, we hear the same old call: to examine our lives together, to define our terms with care, to justify our claims, and to accept the consequences of our reasons. That is the global shift. That is the political life of the Socratic method. It does not promise perfection, but it offers a durable path toward more intelligible, more legitimate, and more participatory governance, a world in which philosophy remains a public art, and the art of questioning becomes a practical instrument for the polis.